Greetings minions and fellow gamers, this is Silverblade, and in this video I'll be doing a comparison between my AMD FX-6300 processor with my new Intel i7-4770K and how it does or doesn't bottleneck with my NVIDIA GTX 1080 video card. First off, I wanted to detail how I come up with these numbers from the benchmarks. The first run that I did was with the GPU and CPU cold at roughly room temperature or idle temps. I wrote down the number and immediately ran it again with the temperature still warm. I wrote down the numbers and then ran it yet again with the temps hot or as hot as they could get to get the last batch numbers. Then I averaged all the numbers that I got for our final results. Secondly, the motherboards I used was a Gigabyte 970A for the FX-6300 processor with 16 gigs of RAM and air cooling with a stock air cooler. The motherboard I used for the i7-4770K was given to me by Pam and Leo Goodman, and it is a Sabertooth Z87 Tough Series board with 32 gigs of RAM and a liquid-cooled CPU through a single-fan radiator AIO by Cooler Master. Other than the motherboard, memory, and CPU differences, everything else pretty much stayed the same, especially the GTX 1080 video card. Do note that these benchmarks run at the maximum settings, running at 1920 by 1080 resolution and full screen, max anti-aliasing, and when possible, full tessellation. The first benchmark I used was Unigen's Heaven benchmarking program, which is a pretty standard program for initial benchmarking results. As you can see, the minimum frames per second show that there was a fairly decent difference between the two processors, with 23.7 frames for the AMD and 30.23 frames for the Intel. This is further accentuated by the maximums, with AMD getting 176.6 frames to Intel's 212.5 frames. The average was 94.1 and 103.83, and the scores were 2370.6 and 2615.83. This shows that for this particular benchmark, there was a fair bit of bottlenecking of data to the GPU by the CPU. Next up was Unigen's Valley benchmark. This one definitely shows how much of a bottleneck there is with the FX-6300, as the results show a roughly 50 to 100% improvement in frame rates. Now the thing to remember about these programs is that they're not the same as each other. Some push more GPU, some push more CPU, which is why I tested a wide variety of benchmarks to try and best simulate results that can be seen by different games. Some games are CPU heavy, some are more GPU heavy, and some are a mix of both. So the minimum results are 16.63 for AMD and 33.76 for Intel, which is slightly more than double. The maximum frames was 104.6 for AMD and 150.66 for Intel, with averages being 66.76 and 90.9 respectively. The AMD scored 2794 and the Intel scored 3803.33, so the Intel was a clear winner here. To round out the Unigen benchmark tests is Superposition. This benchmark is a bit different from the previous two, so the results are actually skewed toward the AMD side. Now I don't know the specifics as to why, but the minimum frame rate for AMD is 24.26, and the Intel had a 24.02, which puts them fairly even if you consider the results in the previous tests. The maximum frame rate was 34.71 for AMD and 33.62 for Intel. The averages show AMD leads by a hair with 29.29 compared to Intel's 29.22, which is really, it's within the margin of error to say that they were essentially the same. The scores were 3912.66 for AMD and 3907 for Intel. If someone could explain to me in the comments why these stats are essentially the same, I'd love to hear from you because it baffles me. Now I move on to in-game benchmarks. These are built into the games using their own graphics engine and graphics settings specific to them. Not all games have a self-benchmarking tool in them, so I had to search my Steam library for them. Anyways, the first one up is Tomb Raider. There really wasn't much of a difference between processors, as AMD had a minimum of 69.23 frames to Intel's 70.63 frames. The maximum was 125.16 frames for AMD to 126.46 for Intel, and the overall average frames were 97.93 for AMD and 99.0 for Intel. This tells me that, for this game at least, the processors really aren't bottlenecking the data to the GPU, at least not to a numerically significant degree that was noticeable. It should be noted that some games are going to be horrifically unoptimized, while others are actually decently optimized for maximum efficiency. Just Cause 2 has not one, but 3 different benchmarks within the game, and apparently each one stresses the CPU and GPU in a different way because I got different results. The first of the 3, called Dark Tower, has AMD with 109.81 frames per second and Intel beating it with 138.8 frames. The second one, called Desert Sunrise, has AMD at 111.3 frames and Intel at 159.75 frames per second. The last of the 3 is called Concrete Jungle, where the frame rate dipped to 64.42 for AMD and 91.97 for Intel. Obviously, with this game, there was a clear bottleneck from the CPU, as frame rates were 30 to 50 frames per second higher. So while Tomb Raider didn't seem to have a bottleneck, this one definitely appears to have one, again proving that a bottleneck isn't always present in every game, but when it is, it can be significant. The last in-game benchmark is Ashes of the Singularity. Unlike other games, this is a top-down strategy game, so it goes about utilizing the GPU a bit differently. Furthermore, I believe this game is one of a few that actually utilizes all the cores on a processor. The FX-6300 claims to have 6 cores, when really it has 3 physical cores and 3 threads, for a total of 6. And the i7-4770K has 4 physical cores with 4 threads, so it has a 2-core thread advantage. Most games don't use more than a single core, so that is something to know. Anyways, the AMD processor had an average of 39.4 frames per second, while the Intel processor had an average of 59.66. This game may not look like much compared to high-detail first-person shooters and the like, but there's a lot going on, and that adds up to higher stress of the CPU as well as the GPU. The very last benchmarks I'll detail in this video is from Cinebench. This one you can download for free, and it will compare your CPU and GPU with other benchmarks. First off is the OpenGL test, which tests the GPU. This should show you how much of a bottleneck there is between processors quite well. When I ran the test on the AMD processor, it had a frames per second score of 79.04. When I ran it on the Intel, it reached 133.17 frames per second, which is about 169% difference. The next test was raw CPU rendering ability, utilizing all the cores and threads to render an image. The AMD received a score of 414.66, while the Intel processor scored a whopping 751, almost twice what the AMD had. Now for one of the most important uses, besides gaming ability, at least for me, is rendering ability. I use Adobe Premiere Pro CC 2018 to edit and render my videos. So on an average week, I have 2.5 hours of video footage to render at 1080p. When I rendered all 5 of the previous week's videos on the AMD processor, it took 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 23 seconds to render. I re-rendered the same videos after I installed the Intel processor, and it took 3 hours, 36 minutes, and 54 seconds, which cut my time by nearly half. This means I can spend less time waiting for it to render, which I usually let it do that while I slept, and more time being productive or doing more gaming. If something goes wrong with the render of one or more videos, I'd have wasted less time redoing it than before, so I'm liking that a lot. In terms of Bitcoin mining, I have seen up to a 50% increase in CPU mining and 10 to 25% increase in mining for my GPU. Because of the liquid cooling on the Intel processor, it is keeping my temps under 50 degrees Celsius on average while at full load, where the AMD processor, which was air-cooled, was going up to 65 degrees Celsius, which is nearly the thermal limit I'm willing to push it to. Playing games, the Intel barely gets over 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, often staying around 35, which makes it a lot cooler in my small room, although the video card still pushes a ton of heat out. If you go to CPUBoss.com and enter in AMD 6300 and Intel i7-4770K in the comparison boxes, it'll show you the actual differences between the two processors, or any processors of your choosing. In terms of multi-core performance, Intel had an 8.4 and AMD a 5.7 rating. For single-core performance, Intel got a 9.0 compared to AMD's 5.5. The AMD doesn't have integrated graphics on the chip like Intel does, so we're going to leave that one out. The Intel has a high performance per watt with a 9.9 compared to AMD's 5.3, but because Intel usually costs way more than AMD, the value is actually pretty much dead even though Intel barely squeaks out to first place. So why did I buy the FX-6300? Simply put, it was the cost. AMD has historically been much cheaper than Intel, and for someone on a tight budget like I have, it's usually the only option on the table. Now don't get me wrong, that processor has served me well for the past 3.5 years, and it was fairly matched with the GTX 760 I had bought at the same time. However, a GTX 1080 is a whole lot of video card, and it won't like to be held back. As much as it plays well with the 4770K, according to Bottlenecks.com, it will really play nice with a much newer Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7, which will likely be the next choice for me when I can afford to do a major upgrade. Until then, this suits me just fine. Finally, I'd just like to convey my heartfelt appreciation to Pamela and Leo Goodman for this motherboard, processor, memory, and a whole lot more. Without their generosity, I'd be a long ways away from trying to provide high quality content in visuals and audio. I don't ask for anything of anybody, but I don't often turn them down when something is offered. But they have helped me a lot. From the shirts I wear in my videos, to the hardware that helps me produce it, to the daily comments that not only encourage me, but also urge me on. I really am grateful to them for all of it. So, thank you very, very much. From the bottom of my heart, you've really helped out me and my channel more than you can ever know. So thanks. So that pretty much sums it all up. I hope this helps anyone looking to get a low budget computer, or at the very least provides some data for someone to make use of. If you found anything about this video that helps, perhaps leave a comment, perhaps a like. As always, there are links in the description box below that could be useful, and until next time, see you later. Twitch, twitch.